Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in another book talk on one of the most curious topics that keeps the domestic as well as the global agenda on a variety of levels busy and engaged. Our author, our speaker this evening is Denari Duffner from Georgetown University, and our moderator for this interesting exchange is Susan Douglas from Center Associate of Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University. I'll make a brief welcome remark and introduce our moderator, and from that, Susan will pick and continue with giving the floor to our speaker. So Susan Douglas, our moderator this evening, received her PhD in World History from George Mason University in 2016, and also an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Her research field is education history and policy in teaching about the world and world religions. She works on instructional design and has published widely on American textbooks and curriculum standards policy, and has authored teaching resources for Unity Productions Foundation, films, grant projects for the National Endowment for the Humanities, the British Council, and the National Center for History in the schools and others. She is currently K-14 Education Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and has conducted teacher workshops for Al-Walid Talat Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. So, Susan, thank you for your leadership this evening, and over to you now.
I'm very happy to do it, and I'm especially happy to introduce my colleague at Georgetown, Denari Duffner. She's an author, educator, and scholar of Muslim-Christian relations who has worked at the Bridge Project, Bridge Initiative at Georgetown in the same center where I have been education outreach person since 2007. Her first book was Finding Jesus Among Muslims, How Loving Islam Makes Me a Better Muslim, and we're happy to have her introduce this evening her second book, Islamophobia, What Christians Should Know and Do About Anti-Muslim Discrimination. She's currently pursuing a PhD in theology and religious studies at Georgetown University, and just told us, in fact, that she teaches undergrads. And she's an associate of the Bridge Initiative, which is a wonderful research project on the study of Islamophobia. Jordan has presented for our teacher attendees several times during the time I was there, and she was also working with the Bridge Initiative. So she is an exacting researcher, as I know, and also an inspiring writer. So I would like to, with great pleasure, turn it over to her to present her important book.
Thank you so much, Susan, and the Rumi Forum. It's such an honor to be with all of you and to get to talk to you about this new book on Islamophobia. What I'm going to do is read a brief passage from the book and then give kind of an overview of the book so that viewers can get a taste of what they'll find. I'm going to tell some of the stories from the book, talk about some of the arguments that I make. So I'm going to share my screen now so that you can see some images that I have associated with some of the different things I'm going to be talking about. So this passage is from the introduction of my book, and it's an anecdote that I think illustrates much of what you'll find in the book and what I'm trying to do. In the dark of night, outside a small mosque in Nashville, Tennessee, an unknown vandal shook a canister of spray paint, the clacking sound bouncing off the white brick walls. The person cast a blood-red stream across the building, spraying its exterior and windows with a hostile message that would greet the congregants of the El Farouk Mosque when they arrived the next morning. Muslims go home. The vandal committed the act just days after a local news program had aired a sensationalist film about the dangers of, quote, homegrown jihad, putting a spotlight on a nearby Muslim community and making unfounded claims that they had connections to terrorist groups. When congregants of El Farouk pulled up to the mosque the next day for their morning prayers, they found more. a series of interlocking crosses, undoubtedly a Christian symbol, spray painted on the side of the building. A letter was also left there, which reportedly referred to Muslims as, quote, friends of Satan and as, quote, a threat to the United States. The community was shaken up, but fortunately their neighbors sprang into action to help. An administrator at Belmont University, a nearby Christian college, quickly reached out to the mosque's leadership. He said, "It was just terrible that the cross, the sign of God's love for us, was used to terrorize, once again, a minority community here in Tennessee. It hadn't been the first time." The administrator offered to have Belmont pay for the materials to remove the graffiti, and he and others from the area quickly scrubbed it away and repainted the walls a crisp white. Thanking the community for their support, the mosque leadership noted that while the vandal had tried to drive a wedge between Christians and Muslims, the act had ultimately brought them closer together. This story reflects much of what this book is about: the prejudice and discrimination that Muslims have faced, the way Christians have contributed to it, and the moral and faith-filled duty that Christians are called to play in upending Islamophobia. So this is the passage that I just read is from the introduction. And I wrote this book for a couple of reasons. And I think it's kind of surprising to many people that I, as a Christian person, would write a book about Islamophobia for a Christian audience. But for me, it's really important. And that is so for two reasons. The first is because Islamophobia as a form of prejudice and discrimination and racism, it infringes on the rights of our fellow human beings, and it is an affront to the dignity of our Muslim siblings in faith. And because of this, because Muslims are harmed by Islamophobia, this is the first and the foundational reason why I think Christians are called to care about Islamophobia and to do something about it. We know from our faith, and I talk about this towards the end of the book, calls us to stand on the side of the marginalized and to stand on the side of the mistreated whenever we can. I also think it's important that Christians learn about and work to combat Islamophobia because of the unfortunate reality that we have oftentimes contributed to it. This anecdote that I just shared is just one example of the ways that Christians have targeted Muslims in hateful attacks. And there are so many more as well, from using Islamophobic stereotypes in sermons at the pulpit, from things that Christian leaders will say in public, and also just from the ways that subtle stereotypes circulate in our Christian communities. So I think we have a real opportunity to actually live out our faith as Christians in a new way when we decide that we are going to learn about Islamophobia and stand up to prejudice both inside and outside our communities. The book is divided into three different broad sections. The first section takes up about half of the book, and there I give an overview of the problem of Islamophobia. I look at lots of different facets, and I will highlight some of those in the course of this presentation. The second part of the book looks at these examples in Christian communities specifically, and I talk about some contemporary problems, but I also dig back into the history of Muslim-Christian relations to look at the roots of some of our present-day problems. And then the last part of the book is the constructive part of the book, the positive part of the book, where I say, we have all of these resources and teachings and traditions as a part of our Christian faith, and we can draw on those in combating Islamophobia. And so I look at some of these theological resources that we have, and then I also give some tangible pieces of advice for different ways that Christians can address Islamophobia. Now I want to say a little bit about how I define Islamophobia in the book. On the face of it, Islamophobia would seem to mean fear of Islam. If we look at the etymology of the word, that's what Islamophobia means. But I define Islamophobia in a broader sense, and this also reflects the ways that journalists and academics use the word as well. And I define Islamophobia as prejudice and discrimination that targets people based on a perceived association with Islam and Muslims. So what does that mean exactly? There's a couple different facets that are at work here. Both Islamophobia is both, I think, the way people think and feel about Muslims, the stereotypes that they have, the ideas that they have about Islam and Muslims. But it's also the tangible ways that Muslims are treated, whether that be hate crimes or more institutionalized forms of discrimination or other issues. Another part of the definition points to the fact that there are people who are not Muslim who are impacted by Islamophobia. I give lots of different examples of this in the book, how people who are perceived or raced as Muslim are oftentimes caught in the crosshairs of Islamophobia. Another part of the definition too is that Islamophobia is not only overt racism. People can contribute to Islamophobia even if they're not intending to be bigoted. And that's, you know, one of the important things to recognize. And I think we know this also from our study and our understanding of other forms of racism, that we can be purveyors of racism or caught up in racist systems even when we don't intend to be. So it's a problem that's that goes beyond our consciously held beliefs about Muslims. The second chapter of the book looks at what I call the not so recent history of Islamophobia in the United States. I think many people in my circles, my Christian circles, only started to realize that Islamophobia was a problem in 2015 or 2016 during the Republican presidential race, where the future President Trump and a bunch of other Republican candidates decided that scapegoating Muslims was going to be a winning political strategy. And that also correlated with surging hate crimes against Muslims, which have since dipped a little bit, but were quite high during that election cycle. And so I talk about the impact of events like September 11th, 2001. This chapter goes back to look at Islamophobia basically after 9/11, looking at these nearly 2 decades since then and the different fluctuations and manifestations of Islamophobia that we saw during that time. One of those things, and I talk about this in that chapter, is the way that Islamophobia has become an industry. I talk about the individuals, the organizations, the movements on a national level to scapegoat and demonize Muslims in public life, and the ways that oftentimes was capitalized on by politicians, particularly on the Republican side. And during this period, I think we saw Islamophobia become more blatant and more concerted. So, you know, I couldn't believe it when the Trump administration, and even before that, when some of the different Republican campaigns in 2016 were hiring and working directly with individuals in the so-called Islamophobia network who had been on my radar for years. These were people that had originally been fringe figures who were promoting fear and misinformation about Muslims, but they became people who our policymakers and our president would go to for information on Islam and Muslims. So these are some of the things that I talk about in this section on the history of Islamophobia in the 21st century. But I also talk about Islamophobia on the political left. I think one of the things that many readers of this book will assume is that Islamophobia is only a problem on the political right. But as I talk about in the book, the Democratic administration under President Obama and other Democratic politicians have allowed for many of the policies of Republicans to be against Muslims to be normalized and to be expanded. So if we think about some of the ways that Muslims were targeted after September 11th, these were normalized and expanded under democratic presidents as well. I also talk in this section about the ways that Islamophobia exists in our broader culture on the left. I personally have heard some of the most anti-Muslim comments made from self-proclaimed coastal elites, or maybe not people who would call themselves coastal elites, but people who see themselves as well-educated, tolerant, open-minded people, and who have ultimately made some of the most harmful and stereotypical comments about Muslims that I have heard. And so I draw attention to some in our pop culture who advance anti-Muslim stereotypes on the left as well. It's also important to recognize that Islamophobia is not just an American problem. I spend some time in the book talking about Islamophobia in Europe and some of the various campaigns and political movements in Europe to marginalize Muslims and to marginalize the practice of Islam. There are also cases of this extending beyond Europe, and I give some examples from India and China. And it goes to show that Islamophobia is, while it has its particular manifestations in local settings, it really is a global problem, and one that we need to be aware of in different parts of the world. One of the things that has been the most interesting for me to learn about in the course of my study of Muslim-Christian relations and my study of Islamophobia has been the ways that contemporary Islamophobia resembles the anti-Catholic bigotry that my ancestors would have faced a few generations ago. This is a cartoon from the mid-1800s that is meant to depict the threat of the Roman Catholic Church on the United States. We see these clerics in hats which are meant to make them look like alligators climbing upon the coast of the United States and are about to attack American Protestant school children. And you look back at cartoons from this period and realize that much of the things that were said about Catholics at the time are now being recycled to smear Muslims. One of these is the claim that Muslims are trying to bring foreign law into America and to institute Sharia over the rest of the country and to put non-Muslims under this supposedly, barbaric form of Sharia law. And as I do in the book, it's important to debunk that claim and to show why it's incorrect and why it's wrong. But I think it's also really helpful to know that this is just another example of primarily recent immigrant groups being smeared with the same kinds of stereotypes that have been used to target other immigrant communities in the past. Nowadays, Catholics are, at least in the place that I grew up, are kind of assumed to be insiders and are assumed to be Christian, but that wasn't always the case. And so I think sometimes people in my own community forget the ways that we were once scapegoated. And were we to recognize that, it would be easier for us to recognize the scapegoating of Muslims that's going on today. I tell a story in the book about a friend of mine named Esed, who, as a college student, started a Muslim charity organization in New York City. This is not Esed in the photo, but he found out in the course of running this charity group that the NYPD, the New York Police Department, had sent a spy an informant into his charity group to report back to law enforcement about what was going on. Basically, and they had sent in this individual not because they had any reason to suspect that there was funny business going on, but because it was a part of a larger program to spy on Muslim communities. And in some cases, these spying programs across the United States have even been undertaken with the goal of trying to stir up trouble or to try to lure people into committing crimes that can then be prosecuted as terrorism. These kinds of these institutionalized forms of Islamophobia are not on the radar of many Christians. And so I think it was a particular concern of mine to address and to give examples of this in the book. I also talk in this section of the book about the implicit biases that many of us have about Muslims. Oftentimes we are unaware that we are holding on to stereotypes, that we are holding on to biases. We think that the way that we think and feel about Muslims is totally natural, and we don't realize that it's founded in untrue stereotypes. So one of the things that I do in the book is tell some stories from my own life and from some of my family members, moments that we have been confronted with our own stereotypes, when we've been in situations where we realized that we were not assuming the best of Muslims, or when we were interpreting things that Muslims were doing in a negative light because of some of the anti-Muslim stereotypes that exist. I then move on in the final section of the book, that's this overview of Islamophobia, to talk directly about some of these anti-Muslim stereotypes. As I say in the chapter title of this part of the book, we should know better. It's important that we learn about some of these stereotypes head on, and we learn about some of the information that actually proves them to be what they are: stereotypes, generalizations, untrue and simplistic ideas about who Muslims are. Another thing that I talk about in this section of the book is an approach that I hear a lot in Christian circles. When people make sweeping comments about Islam, they'll say, oh, well, Islam says this, or Islam teaches that, as if there is no internal diversity in the Muslim tradition at all. I think oftentimes in my Christian community, negative assumptions are made of Muslims because people are unaware of some of the diversity that exists in the Islamic tradition. People only know the terrorists that they see on TV, and they don't know the ways that Muslims live their faith out in really heroic ways, but also in really ordinary ways. And so it's important to draw attention to some of that, and I also do that in the book. Part 2 of the book looks at Christians specifically, and I won't go into all of the examples, but I deal with a lot of the issues that Christians have with Islamophobia today, things that pastors will say from the pulpit. Also the issue of Christian congregations prioritizing the needs of their own religious community over that of Muslims. So I'm thinking, for example, of when people are fleeing violence, say in the Middle East, there's often a tendency among Christians to say, oh, well, we should only care for our own flock. We should only welcome in Christians. And to say that Muslims don't deserve our welcome, don't deserve our help. And oftentimes that's wrapped up in stereotypes about Muslims being violent or dangerous or oppressive, these common tropes about Muslims. Another thing I talk about in this section of the book that's kind of new is the way that the Islamophobia industry, or the Islamophobia network that I mentioned earlier, has, in a sense, a Catholic wing. It also has an evangelical wing. But what I do in this book is to shine a light on some of the ways that the Islamophobia network has shaped Catholic views in the United States, in part by publishing lots of articles in Catholic publications, and Catholic institutions and media outlets actually allowing themselves to be platforms for anti-Muslim voices. As I mentioned earlier, I also have a chapter that talks about the history of Muslim-Christian relations and some of the things that shape our contemporary issues today. And I think, that's important because my sense is that many in my Christian community know a lot of the things in history, a lot of the bad things in history that Muslims have done to us, but we don't know the history of the harm that we have caused Muslim communities. So that's one of the things that I do, that I spend a lot of time doing in this chapter, is introducing readers to these histories that we don't know. And then finally, I give 2 chapters on how we can respond to Islamophobia. One of the things I'm really excited about is drawing on what's called Catholic social teaching to craft a Catholic and a Christian response to Islamophobia. So I look at these different principles that we have in the Catholic Church and talk about how they apply to Islamophobia and how they can inspire us to action. And there's lots of tangible ways that we can do this. We can support Muslims during hard times. We can use our bodies even to stand up for Muslims in moments where people might be in harm's way. And I also spend a lot of time talking about how we can have hard conversations with our fellow Christians. I think that's one of the most important things we can do, is to not let Islamophobic comments slide by and to normalize a new way of being and thinking about our Muslim siblings in faith. So I'm going to leave it there and see if any of you have questions. And thanks so much for staying with me as I give this sweeping tour of the book.
Thank you very much, Jordan. That was very illuminating. And I think we have, the number of people that we have is quite manageable. So I would very much like to welcome questions by the group directly rather than just in chat. So feel free to raise a hand in the response, Zoom response reactions section, or otherwise unmute yourself and I will be happy to call on you with your questions. Yes, go ahead, Ms. Chivitz.
I would love to hear a couple of you, well, a lot of, but that I could read the book for a couple of the specifics, how in discourse with our own communities to add a little light to the anti-Muslim comments. That's so hard to do anywhere, but it's so hard to do in the South with the anti-Black racist comments. And I'm not skilled at all with the anti-Muslim ignorance, which is what it is. Can you give us any couple of specifics?
Sure. So first, I just want to sympathize and say that these conversations are really hard. And I talk in the book about my own failures in this regard and times where I shouldn't have, or I should have stood up and said something, but I didn't. Or conversations that I've had where I really haven't succeeded in offering a new perspective that was received. A couple things that I talk about in the book. One is, and this is an approach I've been using more lately, is when someone says, makes some kind of generalization or stereotypical comment about Muslims, I ask them to talk it out a little bit more, because usually in the course of that, they realize that it's a stereotype. They realize that they are not being fair in this kind of broad assumption that they've made about Muslims. So I'll say things like, I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to say, or I don't actually see things that way. Can you explain more what you mean by that? Or, I mean, obviously, if it's a really egregious comment, I think we need to say, kindly, that's not true, or that's not right. One thing that I think is intimidating for a lot of people in these, like yourself, in these conversations, who want to do the right thing but don't know what to do, is we feel like we don't know enough to respond in an informed way. And so I think what we can, if we don't have the information to debunk the stereotype that they're using, what we can do is reflect their stereotype back to them, or to say, I don't see things this way. Or I think another really great thing is if you happen to, to know people who are Muslim or something like that, you can say, well, that's not how my neighbor so-and-so understands her Islam or something like that, to give people exposure to new perspectives in a way that doesn't totally shut them down. I have had to be content with the fact that I'm not always going to leave a conversation having in that moment had my interlocutor realize that they've said something wrong. But what I hope to do is to at least add new information or upset the way that they have been thinking, so that on their own time, and then, you know, when they're not in some kind of conversation where they're feeling like they have to be defensive, they can reflect on their own thinking about Muslims and maybe revise it kind of on their own time. So it's being realistic about what we can expect from these conversations, but also I have real hope that change can be made.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there another question right now from the present audience on Zoom? Don't be shy.
Bilal's hand is up.
Hello,
Yes, go
thank
ahead.
you. Thank you very much for an engaging presentation. I look forward to reading the book. I haven't had the opportunity to do so yet. In regards to, I mean, these attitudes are deeply entrenched in societies, and they obviously come from a place of ignorance, either because people haven't had that personal relationship with Muslims to really see the human side of people and to see the human side of a living faith. And this sense of alienation creates, I think, a vacuum where these kinds of ideas can really start to fester, especially if they go unchallenged. But in terms of, like, especially with these two faiths and people of these faiths having a shared history and tradition, how can it be facilitated? Or do you think there's a space, especially in parts of America, where that kind of approach can be incorporated into the teaching of a shared tradition to show that we actually have so much more in common, both in terms of our shared Abrahamic tradition, of a historical tradition? I mean, the first place Muslims went to in terms of seeking refuge and safety was to a Christian land, Abyssinia at the time. And then we've seen people who went on to become popes going to Islamic universities to study and learn. And there was a transfer of knowledge and culture and traditions. And there's so much now, which, I mean, I remember a couple of years ago in our local mosque, we have during Ramadan, we have one day which is an open iftar, so everyone's welcome. And I was giving one of the local priests a tour of our mosque, and he saw some slides depicting Christ, and he was surprised to see that. And I was surprised to learn he didn't know how much we revere Christ, not just as a prophet, but also as a messenger. And we were talking about how much richness there is and how much in common between our traditions, to the extent that even things like the modern graduate ceremony is taken entirely from the Islamic tradition of education. So how can this shared tradition be brought into the churches, be brought into mainstream education, so that vacuum where ignorance thrives is slowly and slowly reduced, so that we have something more nourishing taking its place?
Yeah, I think it's a slow but steady process, and it's one that I'm trying to do in my work, is to help people in my own community recognize that so many similarities do exist between Islam and our own tradition. One of the things I have found that Catholics are blown away by is the fact that Mary is an important figure in the Islamic tradition. I think, and I did an entire survey when I was working at the Bridge Initiative on what Catholics know about Islam. People are really shocked to learn that Mary is an important figure, and it means a lot to them because Mary is someone, you know, this holy religious figure who's important to them too. And we don't have a lot of exposure to beliefs other than our own in Catholic schools growing up. I went to Catholic school growing up, and I didn't learn anything about Islam until high school, except for when we learned about very briefly, the origins of Islam in social studies class, like as a part of history, which I would be very curious now, knowing what I know from my, my higher education to revisit that elementary school education and see how it was presented, because I'm sure it was limited and warped, unfortunately. But yeah, I think one of the really important things is also educating our clergy. And that's something that I really want to commit to more after I finish my PhD program. One of the things that really troubles me are the ways that priests in my community have absorbed information or misinformation from the Islamophobia network and normalize that understanding of Islam in our Catholic community. So I think it's really important that in seminaries and in training institutions and things like that, that priests and our leaders have exposure to Islam, and not just learn about Islam in a detached way, but to learn about Islam from Muslims. I think that's so important, because I think sometimes when outsiders present the tradition, they do it in a way that will either make it fit really like will present it in a way that confirms their own sense of uniqueness or sense of identity or sense of virtuousness. That's often what I find in Catholic presentations of Islam, is that Islam is cast as this tradition that's different in so many ways, and it doesn't actually allow Muslims to speak for themselves. That's not to say there aren't differences, but it is to allow Muslims to say, this is what our tradition is about. These are the values we have. This is how we interpret our stories. All of those things I think are really important. And we need to do more to support that kind of learning in Christian settings.
Okay, I'd like to go to a question that has come in from the YouTube section here. One of the questions they received was, how can we differentiate between xenophobia and Islamophobia when the Muslim community is faced with not just talk but and sentiments, but anti-Muslim acts and comments?
Sorry, would you mind reading that one more time,
Well,
Susan?
the difference is how we can differentiate between xenophobia in general and Islamophobia. I think the questioner is looking at kind of the action side that has become so common in the survey that you mentioned of hate crimes and things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think Islamophobia is part and parcel of a broader trend of xenophobia that we have seen in the United States in recent years. I mean, I tell a story in the book about a young Muslim child who was, he faced some really horrible comments by a fellow student of his the day after President Trump was elected back in 2016. And we saw reports that day that this was not just experienced by Muslims, but this was, experienced by so many people of color, by so many recent immigrants who, were all being lumped together as this other who was a valid scapegoat, who many Americans and President Trump didn't want here. And so Islamophobia definitely is intimately tied up with a broader fear of otherness. I also think, though, that Islamophobia has its unique facets and its own unique history. So yeah, I guess to speak more about the institutionalized forms of discrimination, these have often targeted Muslims who are non-citizens. So I talk in the book, for example, of the NSEERS program that was started during the Bush administration after September 11th, which basically required non-citizen Muslim men to register. I think it was some crazy number, like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of non-citizen Muslim men had to register for this program. And there are so many other ways that non-citizens in particular, for people who didn't have citizenship here, were targeted. So I'm not sure if that totally answers the question, but some of the things that I think about when I think about the intersection between Islamophobia and other broader forms of discrimination.
Right, and of course, there have been a lot of references to the Japanese internment as a parallel to the reaction after 9/11, and in fact, impassioned
Absolutely.
calls from people who were affected by it or their families were affected by it to not have that response.
Yes,
to
and that to that point, it also came up in one of the comments here in the group chat. Um, I think when people think back on the internment of Japanese Americans, the ways that the Jewish community has been treated, Catholics. I mean, when we realize that this is a pattern in the United States, and not to mention our deep history of anti-Black racism and the treatment of Native Americans. I mean, this is part and parcel of broader issues of white supremacy in the United States, even as all of these particular problems have their own unique facets too.
Well, I have to argue for education, of course, as a solution, but we do have a question here on how to change these stereotypes and how to cope with xenophobia in general. Now, that's a huge question, but I trust you to have some at least initial answers.
Yeah, so I think, as I said earlier, I think to a certain extent, debunking the stereotypes is helpful. Like, for example, if someone says, oh, Muslim women are oppressed, to give information in response to that demonstrates that no, this is a stereotype. There are many ways that Muslim women are very empowered. And even when there might be issues with women's rights in Muslim communities or in Muslim majority societies, that this isn't a uniquely Muslim problem. There are ways that we can use facts and deploy them in ways that help debunk the stereotypes. But I also think sometimes, though, when we do that, we get caught in this spiral of follow-up questions, or at least I have when I've dealt with these kinds of people I'm in conversation with. They'll say, "Oh, well, if not that, then what about this?" And then I have to start answering a different question about Muslims, and then once I answer that in a satisfactory way, they'll say, "Oh, but what about this?" And so what it makes me realize is that their questions are not actually coming from they're coming from a genuine place, but it's not a logical or rational place. It's coming from an emotional place, and because they want to feel justified in this fear or kind of oppositional attitude that they have towards Muslims. So I think we have to upset that in other ways. We have to give people exposure to Muslims, not necessarily even in in-person dialogue settings, but through media and through social media. And then we also, I think, have to talk about the function that stereotypes play, and the history of some of these stereotypes, which is something that I do. Like, I talk about how, the idea that Muslims are inherently violent, which is a very common misperception that many Americans and particularly Christians have, that has served a particular agenda at times. It's advanced in our media and by our politicians because it serves financial or political or imperialistic interests in many cases. So that it's not easy to do that, but I think it's important to at least initiate the process of educating in those ways.
Okay, thank you. Marie Clark has a question, had raised her hand.
Yes, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I wanted to ask more about this Islamophobia network that you've been talking about. Can you tell us more of the history of this? And is it just a network of people, or are there specific organizations that make it up? That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so I could do a whole presentation on the Islamophobia network. And I spend more time on it in the book, and there's other reports and books that deal with it exclusively. But yeah, so in the wake of September 11th in particular, there were a number of individuals and organizations that cropped up who were writing best-selling books on Islam, who were appearing as commentators on cable news, and who were trying to work particularly with Republican politicians, to kind of both inculcate a particular view of stereotypical view of Muslims, and then to also shape policy in some ways to target Muslims. So if you remember back to 2010, this is when the Islamophobia industry became really active. There was the whole controversy around what was dubbed the Ground Zero Mosque. Basically, Muslims in New York City had wanted to build what was effectively like a Muslim YMCA. And it happened to be not far from where the September 11th attacks occurred. And this group of writers and organizations and other individuals stirred it up into this big national controversy. And what was so troubling and about this was that it was also capitalized on by politicians who then ran on kind of an anti-Muslim platform. And that year, the Republicans won the midterms, in part because of the way that they capitalized on what effectively was anti-Muslim scapegoating. And so there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between the Islamophobia network and other segments of society like politics and government and things like that. I mean, the people that work for these outfits, these organizations that promote Islamophobia, they make a lot of money, and they sell a lot of books, and they give speaking gigs all over the country. And it's really unfortunate because it is one of the reasons why I think the American public isn't simply ignorant about Muslims, but actually has really entrenched negative and untrue views, negative views of Muslims that aren't based in reality. So that's, just a little bit, but gives you kind of a taste of what I'm talking about when I say the Islamophobia network.
There was a follow-up comment that speaks to that, which is something you also mention in your book, is how often the quote in quotes authorities who speak about these things are not really authorities at all and are just getting their information from biased sources, or are intentionally forwarding information that is not authoritative. And so you mentioned in your book how these Islamophobia network reinforces each other with the citing books and going back again and citing each other in this kind of network that makes it look as though it is much more mainstream and accepted than it is.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I'm really glad you brought it up because these individuals, they didn't, most of them that I can think of off the top of my head, the prime mover, the movers and shakers in this arena, they don't have PhDs in Islamic studies. I talk about Robert Spencer, for example. He doesn't have, any demonstrated academic credentials in the study of Islam, and yet has built this entire career around teaching people about Islam and Muslims. So it's but yeah, because of how they cross post each other's articles, they cite each other, they write books, those things add to their credibility. And people don't, and the thing is too, because the American public is already so used to this way of thinking about Muslims, they oftentimes don't question the stereotypical presentation of Islam when they hear it in the news.
And of course, some of them have been elevated by exposure on the mainstream media or in the, with having the president's ear and so on. We have another question from Professor Valkenberg.
Thank you very much, Susan, for giving me the floor. Thank you very much, Jordan, for doing your work and meeting you again. My question is maybe a little bit more personal, if I may, because one of the things that I notice when I use, for instance, your books in my class or refer to the work that the Bridge Initiative does, some of the students in my university, the Catholic University of America, tend to say, yeah, they're doing good work, but it's also one-sided. They don't show the other side. Now, that's a type of reaction that gets me somewhat tired and probably gets you very tired as well. So I was very pleased when I saw some time ago this number of Concilium with the title Signs of Hope in Christian-Muslim Relations, because I think it is so easy to get into despair because you do not have the feeling that you really can move forward, and sometimes you move forward, but then again you move backward. So my question is, can you indicate what possibilities you see to, let's say, broaden the coalition of people who are fighting against Islamophobia, not preaching for your own parish only. So what's ways that we can do to kind of broaden this work and to find maybe new allies?
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Valkenburg. It's good to see you again, even if it's just virtual. So I have also heard the reaction that you talk about a lot when I particularly when I give talks at Catholic institutions. They'll say, okay, well, like, yeah, Islamophobia is wrong, but what about persecution of Christians? Do Muslims care about that? And so I knew that it was really important to address that hesitation head on in the book, because for whatever reason, so many of us feel like there needs to be some kind of reciprocation, you know, despite the fact that the golden rule says nothing about, you know, waiting for someone to do something nice for you before you do something nice for them. People have that, I think, kind of implicit psychological need to know that they care about us too, that Muslims also care about us and are trying to help us. And so I try to draw attention to a lot of examples of that in the book, while also pointing out the fact that both of our religious communities have a lot of work to do, that neither of us are perfect, and that there is still a lot of Muslim on Christian discrimination and Christian on Muslim discrimination. But I think at least the way that I'm trying to, I guess, widen the group of allies here is to try to actually draw more attention to the good that Muslims are doing in the world, and for Christians in particular. I have found that is a really effective way of actually getting Christians on board, because they say, oh, okay, like I can care about them because they care about us too. I wish it didn't have to require that, but I think just strategically it's kind of important. And you know, and I think also, you know, a lot of this just goes back to other forms of dialogue and the dialogue of social action. For example, I think if Christians, say, are not comfortable like advocating against Islamophobia, maybe a starting point is working with Muslims to combat some kind of other social injustice or issue of, you know, poverty in the community or something like that. And then in that setting, you know, maybe they'll understand why Islamophobia isn't fair and why they should do more to address it. So that's what I would say.
Well, sort of as a bumper sticker, you know, it's better to join hands than point fingers. And I think there's a lot of room, which you also refer to in your book, for looking for common ground, because there are so many problems that that the siblings, Abrahamic siblings, as you call them, can address together based on their common values. I'd like to next call Anina Fernando from Shoulder to Shoulder, who wrote an extensive comment in chat, and perhaps you could pose your question yourself, if you prefer.
Hi, everyone. I am really grateful for this conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rumi Forum, for all that you do. Jordan, I'd just love to hear from you about your personal story. What brought you into this work? How did you first step into Christian-Muslim engagement? How did you particularly think about the difference between Islam, learning about Islam, and learning about how to address Islamophobia? I think that there's often this assumption that if you learn about Islam, you somehow will understand Islamophobia more, when there's so much more to it, as you shared in your comments and in your book, and then also just what motivates you to make change on this issue personally.
Thank you, and it's good to be with you virtually too. My interest in this, or passion in this work, goes back to my high school days, really. And I tell a story in the book about receiving this chain email message that had circulated in my Catholic community, and it was an anti-Muslim chain email message. It basically equated Muslims with the terrorists that people were seeing on TV. And I was really distressed by this because I knew some Muslim students at my high school, and I knew that they were good people and that they didn't match this picture that was presented of them in this email. And then I was also concerned because I knew that the Christian family friends of mine who had sent around this biased and prejudicial message were also good people. And so I thought, there's a real disconnect here between the values that we have as Christians, the fact that we do live our faith in so many beautiful, loving ways, but then we have this kind of blind spot when it comes to Islamophobia, that we don't realize that in disseminating these stereotypes and these hateful ways of viewing Muslims around our community is harmful. The email actually basically encouraged people to send the email around, because if you didn't, you were actually contributing to the problem of ignorance about the threat of Islam and things like that. And so people thought they were doing the right thing. And so, that email in many ways, and the disconnect that it illustrated to me, or that it exposed to me, is kind of what I'm trying to remedy in the book. And since then, I've had so many really fantastic experiences of interreligious dialogue and friendship with Muslims. And it's those personal experiences of friendship that really motivate this work. I mean, I don't want my Muslim friends to have to experience the sorts of things that I write about in the book, or particularly the children of my friends. I hope that, when the children of my friends, one day read this book, that all of this will be history to them. This is something that I hope we can move past. I also do it though, because, for my Christian community, because I think we can do better. And I think we ultimately are living up to our faith and living out our faith more when we do this. To speak to the other question that you asked, I talk early in the book about the difference between education on Islam and education about Islamophobia. And I think there's kind of, as you know, and I think Shoulder to Shoulder has been really instrumental in this, there's been kind of a shift in the circles that we run in to say, okay, it's not enough to just teach people about Islam, but we also have to teach people about how racism, this form of racism and racism in general, work. We have to address these stereotypes head on, and not just debunk them, as I was saying before, but also to talk about the ways that the function that stereotypes play, the way that they serve as crutches sort of for us to not think critically when it comes to thinking about thinking about other people. So I think, I do think education about Islam is really important. I mean, I'm teaching an Islam 101 class to undergrads in the fall. So I think that that's really important, but it's, and also for me, I'm not just teaching these students about Islam because I'm trying to combat Islamophobia, but because I just think that this is a religious tradition that means a lot to a lot of people, and that people need to know about, simply because it's valuable, and to learn about other religious traditions, not simply as a solution to some other problem, which is an important problem. The other thing, though, that I think that teaching about Islam does that aids in the work to combat Islamophobia is that it also just kind of initiates, more than anything, like an emotional shift in the person who's learning. You might not remember all of the information about, how Muslims pray, or, the history of different Muslim powers, or stories from the Quran, or things like that. But when people have an exposure to real lived religion and real life people, that has an impact on how you view religious groups as a whole. It impacts, or it makes you less susceptible to buy into stereotypes, because you know that this is a diverse and beautiful religious tradition, even if it's not your own. So that's, speaks a little bit to what you were asking.
It's interesting, I think, and very revealing, Jordan and the questioner, Anina, that the Islamophobic industry and speakers have gone to great lengths to try to portray teaching about religion in public education as proselytizing. They'd rather not that this kind of information be brought out. I'm going to call now on the director of Rumi Forum, Ibrahim Anli.
Thank you. So a note on this teaching of Islam. One is that resistance, categorical resistance against any effort to make it part of a meaningful part of a curriculum. And the other is a form of Islam that teaching Islam that is pretty much intoxicated with Orientalist cliches. So that teaching has not been a blessing at all. To the contrary, it reinforced and it kept informing many practices in a very subtle way that is difficult to point out to, but in a very powerful way at the same time. So it is great to see with your efforts at Bridge and allies like Shoulder to Shoulder and many other faith or interfaith that, and also in the academy, that it is being liberated from those cliches to a great extent. Thank you.
Yeah, just to respond to that, I think you're right. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine, a Christian friend of mine, as I was writing this book, and she was saying how in high school, and this friend went to an elite high school, and she was telling me that, yeah, in school we learned that, Islam is a political religion, and, all of these kind of stereotypical ways of viewing Islam that ultimately were not helpful to, as you said, not helpful to the cause of upending any sort of stereotype. So, and as I was saying before, the problem in so many cases in the United States is not that people are completely ignorant. It's that what they think they know about Islam does not at all match Muslims' experience of their own tradition, or how Muslims think about Islam, or just what's objective fact. And it's easier to teach people when they know they're ignorant. It's really hard to get people to think differently when they think they already know the answer. So yeah, that's what we're kind of up against. And I mean, Susan does such phenomenal work with educators, and I know it's had such a big impact, particularly in the DC area, on the teaching of Islam. So,
well, thank you for that little opening to talk about the constitutional guidelines for teaching about religion that have done a lot to improve the situation, to give us a set of standards for what teaching about religion should look like. And I think the last time that you spoke for one of our groups was the Summer Institute on teaching about world religions, in which we visited, I think, 6 or 7 local sites of worship, and spoke to leaders and had academics come in and talk about the religions from the perspective of what teachers teach. And we had very good audience, and we also have some people in Montgomery County, like that have been doing courses for a long time. Chris Murray has done courses on this with teachers every summer for quite a while, probably an exception to the COVID time that we've just lived through. But this is not to be underestimated, how this objective framework for the academic study of religions in public schools has really improved, taking things like like secular humanism as a particular perspective, not as a neutral perspective for teaching about religion. And so it's been beneficial to teaching about all religions. I just want to thank you for that little chance to mention, because the First Amendment Center, particularly Charles Haynes, for many, many decades has put forward these guidelines, and they've become quite widely accepted among school administrators, curriculum supervisors, textbook editors, I will add, and teachers as well. So Maria Clark has her hand up.
Yes, I'm an anthropologist, so I have to ask whether or not you've had any collaboration with anthropologists. We've come a long way from the Margaret Mead, Louis Leakey days, and there are anthropologists pursuing very contemporary issues, and there are anthropologists of all faiths all over the world. And they could be valuable allies. They probably already are, but I wanted to ask. And I just want to add that in terms of the getting to know and understand people in their cultural context, Friendship Force International has been pursuing making peace through friendship for 40 years by having people hosted in other cultural contexts and hosting them. And it is maybe not the fastest way, but it has been a very effective way. And I wanted to mention that Ibrahim will be giving a talk for our group, a Zoom, on the 28th of this month. And I think he'll be sending you a notice about it. We'll be sharing a little bit about Friendship Force. But anyway, the real question is, have you been working with any anthropologists? And if not, if I could help you connect with people.
Yes, offline, I would love to, or after this session, I would love to hear more from you and have you connect me with some folks. There are some anthropologists that that do work on this this issue of Islamophobia who I know and who I have learned from. One of them that is coming to mind right now is Mubashir Rizvi, who taught for several years at Georgetown and who focuses a lot on institutionalized forms of Islamophobia and things like that. Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of anthropology that I drew on for this book, but it was a very interdisciplinary project. There were lots of different fields that I was drawing from, and in particular, some insights from like social psychology and behavioral economics that have shaped this work. So I look forward to connecting more and hearing some of your recommendations.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Would someone like to raise their hand who's here present, or a question coming from elsewhere? Rachel Hansen.
Mine is just a repeat of the question I dropped into the chat, which was if you could share a link to that resource you just mentioned, the constitutional guidelines for teaching religion, I guess. I Googled it, but I'm not sure I came up with the right thing.
The constitutional guidelines, you can find them at the Freedom Forum. It used to be in the museum, which is now closed, but it is, there's not a lot of time to hunt for the exact link, but the Religious Liberty Institute at the Freedom Forum is where you would find those guidelines. Or I will put my email into the chat and I will be able to find that for you.
Well, that's helpful. I think that's what came up in my Google search. So
yeah, and I have a great number of resources that would be able to inform you. So I'm putting my email in the chat right now, and I'll follow up with you on that. There you go. Any other questions, or I will kind of wrap it up with one big question, and that would be what do you hope for from your outreach to Catholics extending to other religious communities about combating Islamophobia?
I hope first and foremost that Catholics and other Christians are more exposed to the reality of Islamophobia and the different ways that Muslims have been impacted by this form of prejudice and discrimination. I think a lot of people in my community, even people who know that Islamophobia is a problem, are not fully aware of the extent of things. And then what I hope we do is, in our own small ways, in our own communities, in our own contexts, can push back against some of the stereotypes that we see, and also that we can push for more systemic change. I think it's really important that Christians get politically active on behalf of the rights of Muslims. That might look different in different contexts, whether it's protesting or advocating for or against certain kinds of policies. But I think it's important that we start to see the well-being of others as our responsibility too. And so that's that's a bit of what I hope that readers will come away from the book with. I also, just lastly, will say that I hope that Christians see this as not tangential to our Christian convictions or our identity as Christians, but rather that this is caring about the religious freedom and the protection of the rights of non-Christians is a natural expression of what it means to be Christian. So ultimately, I hope this is something that can enrich and strengthen our faith, even though it's dealing with a different faith community.
Okay, thank you very much. I really want to thank you, Jordan, for your work in writing this book and the amazing research that you've been doing for a long time. I wish you all the best in continuing, because this is going to be a long road to hoe, so to speak.
Yeah.
I'd also like to express my gratitude on both of our behalfs to the Rumi Forum for making this gathering possible. I think it's been a very rich conversation.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's been a real joy to be with the people on the call live and also with those who've been streaming on YouTube. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, and wish you all a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.